A millionaire humiliated his personal chef at a party, calling her food mediocre. Her unexpected revelation left the room in complete silence. The Grayson estate stood as a testament to opulence, a sprawling mansion perched atop the most coveted hill in the city. Its massive glass windows reflected the twinkling skyline, while inside, chandeliers bathed the grand hall in warm, golden light. Tonight, the estate buzzed with life, hosting yet another of Ethan Grayson's infamous soirees. For Ethan, these parties were not mere social gatherings. They were a stage where he flaunted his wealth, charm, and unrivaled authority. Ethan, a man of polished arrogance, moved through the crowd with a practiced ease that made everyone feel noticed, yet insignificant. His sharp, tailored suit spoke of a man who never compromised on perfection, and the slight smirk on his face hinted at a confidence that bordered on condescension. He relished the role of host, basking in the admiration of the wealthy elite who hung on to his every word. "Ethan, my friend," drawled Robert Langston, a fellow billionaire and longtime acquaintance, as he clinked glasses with him. "Another spectacular evening. Only you could pull off a guest list like this." Ethan chuckled, his teeth gleaming under the chandelier light. "Well, Robert, when you've got the right resources, the rest falls into place." His voice carried effortlessly, reaching the ears of onlookers eager to hear his pearls of wisdom. The party was in full swing. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms weaved through the room, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Guests, draped in designer couture, mingled under the domed ceiling adorned with intricate frescoes. Yet, beyond the glittering crowd and lavish decor, something less visible brewed, a moment waiting to unfold that would shift the night's narrative. In the kitchen, Lila Carter adjusted her chef's jacket, her movements precise as she inspected the final touches on the evening's main course. Her station was immaculate, a reflection of her own discipline. A large silver pot simmered quietly on the stove, filling the room with the comforting aroma of citrus and herbs. Around her, sous chefs worked with synchronized efficiency, guided by her calm yet firm instructions. Chef Carter called out one of her assistants, holding up a tray of perfectly plated salmon. "We're ready for the first round." Lila stepped forward, inspecting the presentation with a critical eye. The dish, a delicate citrus-glazed salmon atop a bed of wild rice with charred asparagus, was a masterpiece. Yet Lila didn't allow herself even a flicker of satisfaction. Excellence wasn't an achievement, it was a standard. "Send it out," she said, her tone cool and composed. "And keep the pace steady. The next course needs to be ready in 15. She leaned against the counter for a brief moment, letting out a controlled breath. Lila had cooked for royalty, celebrities, and heads of state. Her culinary expertise had earned her a Michelin star, but tonight, she was just a name on Ethan Grayson's payroll, a fact she reminded herself of with every step. In the dining hall, the main course was unveiled with dramatic flair. Waiters glided between tables, placing dishes before the impeccably dressed guests. The room was awash with murmurs of approval, the sight and aroma of the food drawing appreciative smiles. Yet at the head of the table, Ethan Grayson was unmoved. Ethan picked up his fork, taking a deliberate bite. The room seemed to pause as all eyes turned to him, waiting for his reaction. He leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face, before finally speaking. "It's fine," he said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Not bad, but certainly not memorable." A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the table. Ethan's closest friends chuckled obligingly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The words hung in the air, sharp and unkind, but Ethan appeared oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the impact of his remark. "Really, though," he continued, addressing his companions, "you'd think for the amount I'm paying, we'd get something a little more inspired. This is what happens when mediocrity masquerades as expertise." In the kitchen, Lila heard every word. The thin walls between the dining room and her domain couldn't shield her from the sting of Ethan's critique. Her hands, steady and skilled, faltered for just a moment as she processed the insult. Around her, the kitchen staff froze, exchanging nervous glances. No one dared to speak. "Chef," one of her sous chefs ventured cautiously. Lila straightened her posture, her face unreadable. "Keep working," she said, her voice clipped. "The second course won't plate itself," but inside, her emotions churned. It wasn't just the words that cut. It was the casual ease with which Ethan had dismissed her efforts. Lila had poured her skill and passion into the evening's menu, and to be reduced to mediocre by a man who likely judged food by its price tag stung deeper than she cared to admit. As the evening wore on, Ethan continued to revel in his own performance, oblivious to the growing tension among his guests. He sauntered from table to table, engaging in conversations laced with veiled boasts and sharp wit. Yet even among his admirers, murmurs of discontent began to surface. "Rather harsh, don't you think?" a guest whispered to her companion. "That poor chef must be mortified." "Well, it's Ethan," the other replied with a shrug. "He's never been one for tact." Meanwhile, Lila stood at the edge of the kitchen, her arms crossed as she watched the scene unfold through a crack in the door. Ethan's laughter rang out, loud and unfiltered, and her jaw tightened. She considered staying silent, retreating to the anonymity of her station. After all, chefs were used to criticism, some of it fair, most of it not. But tonight, something shifted. Perhaps it was the way Ethan spoke with such unearned authority, or the memory of the years she had spent perfecting her craft, only to have it dismissed in a single sentence. Whatever the reason, Lila made a decision. "Chef, are you?" her sous chef began, but Lila raised a hand to silence him. "I've got this," she said firmly. With measured steps, Lila pushed through the kitchen doors and entered the dining hall. The clinking of glasses and murmured conversations softened as she approached the table. Ethan noticed her too late, his expression shifting from amusement to faint surprise. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I couldn't help but overhear your thoughts on the food tonight. I thought it only fair to address them directly." Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly recovered. "Ah, the chef herself," he said, his tone laced with mock respect. "I suppose you'd like to defend your creative choices?" Lila met his gaze without flinching, her composure unshaken. "Not defend, no," she replied. "But perhaps I can offer some context, if you're willing to listen." The room held its collective breath. Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "By all means," he said, a smirk playing at his lips. "Entertain us." Lila's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Oh, I intend to," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "Because it seems there's something you don't know about the person you just dismissed as mediocre." The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation. And as the seconds ticked by, Ethan found himself, for the first time that evening, uncertain of what would come next. As Lila walks into the dining hall to confront Ethan, "Let me ask you this. What would you do in her place? Would you speak your mind or stay silent?" Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more compelling tales. Your support means the world to us. The silence that followed Lila's pointed words rippled through the dining hall like a dropped stone in a still pond. Guests exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. It was not every day that a chef, hired to quietly execute their craft behind the scenes, confronted the host of such an elite gathering. Yet here she was, Lila Carter, standing in the open, her chef's whites stark against the sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits. Ethan Grayson, ever the king of his domain, arched an eyebrow. His smirk widened as if the situation amused him, though there was an unmistakable flicker of irritation in his eyes. The room was his arena, and he was not accustomed to being challenged, least of all by someone he considered beneath him. "Well," Ethan drawled, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands in mock patience. "I'm all ears, chef. Enlighten us." Lila took a measured breath. The weight of dozens of eyes on her shoulders might have unnerved someone else, but she stood tall, her confidence unwavering. "It's not often I get the chance to address my diners directly," she began, her tone even, her words deliberate. "But I feel compelled to clarify a few things." Her gaze swept over the table, pausing briefly on the array of faces before her. Some looked intrigued, others sympathetic, and a few, like Ethan's closest allies, were expressions of thinly veiled disdain. None of it fazed her. This was not about vanity or vindication. It was about respect for her craft and for herself. "I've been cooking for over a decade," she continued, "and in that time, I've learned that food is more than just sustenance. It's an expression of culture, history, and emotion. Every dish that leaves my kitchen is crafted with intention and care. Tonight's menu is no exception." Ethan's smirk faltered slightly, but he maintained his air of superiority. "A lovely sentiment, chef," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I fail to see how that excuses mediocrity." There it was again, that word. Mediocre. The sharp edge of it cut through the air, but Lila refused to let it draw blood. Instead, she allowed a small smile to play on her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I suppose mediocrity is a matter of perspective," she replied. Her voice was calm, yet there was a subtle force behind it, a quiet challenge that didn't go unnoticed by the room. "And perhaps it's easier to judge from the comfort of a chair than from the pressure of the kitchen." A murmur of approval passed through the crowd, barely audible but present nonetheless. Ethan's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his amusement giving way to annoyance. The balance of power was shifting, and he could feel it. At the far end of the table, a woman in a midnight blue gown leaned toward her companion. "She's brave," she whispered, her tone equal parts admiration and disbelief. "I'd never have the nerve to speak to Ethan like that." "Brave or foolish," the man replied, his voice low. "You know how he gets when someone challenges him." Lila, oblivious to the whispers, continued. "When I was approached to design tonight's menu, I was given full creative freedom," she said, addressing the table rather than Ethan directly. "I chose dishes that would complement the season, highlight fresh, local ingredients, and provide a balance of flavors. I stand by those choices." She paused, letting her words settle before meeting Ethan's gaze once more. "But I also understand that not everyone appreciates the same things. That's the beauty of food. It's subjective." "However," she added, her voice sharpening just enough to make Ethan sit up slightly, "what I won't accept is disrespect, especially from someone who may not fully understand what they're criticizing." The room fell silent. Ethan's smirk was gone now, replaced by a hardened stare. He was not a man who tolerated being spoken to in this manner, least of all in front of an audience. Still, he managed to maintain his composure, though his tone was noticeably colder when he spoke. "Are you implying that I lack the palate to appreciate fine cuisine?" he asked, his words slow and deliberate. Lila tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I'm implying," she said carefully, "that true appreciation requires more than just tasting. It requires understanding. And with all due respect, Mr. Grayson, I'm not sure you've taken the time to understand." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Some guests looked down at their plates, unwilling to involve themselves in what was becoming an increasingly personal exchange. Others watched with bated breath, captivated by the unfolding drama. Ethan's fingers drummed lightly against the tablecloth. For the first time in a long while, he felt the unfamiliar sting of public embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lila spoke again. "Of course," she said, her tone softening just enough to temper the sharpness of her previous words, "I wouldn't expect you to take my word for it. After all, I'm just a chef. But perhaps you'd find it more compelling to know that before I became just a chef, I earned my Michelin star at Lumiere." The name landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the room, and Ethan's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to shock. Lumiere was legendary, a beacon of culinary excellence, the kind of place where reservations were booked months in advance. Its head chef had been a rising star in the culinary world, celebrated for her innovative approach and unwavering dedication to her craft. That head chef had been Lila Carter. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the poised, unassuming woman before him with the powerhouse chef whose name had once graced the cover of culinary magazines. The room buzzed with hushed conversations as the weight of Lila's revelation sank in. "She's that Lila Carter?" someone murmured. I read about her last year. Didn't she leave Lumiere too? To open her own restaurant? Another guest interjected. I thought she was retired. Ethan, still reeling, forced a tight smile. Well, he said, his voice strained. That's quite the resume. Lila inclined her head slightly, her calm demeanor unshaken. Thank you, she said simply. Though I prefer to let my work speak for itself. She stepped back, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Enjoy the rest of your evening, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan and his guests to grapple with the echoes of her parting words. Lila's departure from the dining hall left an almost tangible void, a silence so heavy that even the clinking of glasses and hushed murmurs felt like an intrusion. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his composure outwardly intact, but the tight grip on his wine glass betrayed his growing discomfort. Around him, his guests exchanged glances, the shock of Lila's revelation still fresh in their minds. She's the chef from Lumiere, a woman whispered to her husband, her voice tinged with both admiration and disbelief. I remember reading about her. She was extraordinary. Well, this is awkward, another guest muttered, hiding their smirk behind a glass of champagne. For the first time in years, Ethan Grayson was not the center of attention. The room's energy had shifted. The awe and respect that had once been directed at him now aimed squarely at the woman who had just walked out. It was an unfamiliar feeling, and Ethan didn't like it. Back in the kitchen, Lila leaned against the counter, her hands braced on its cool surface as she took a deep, steadying breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained unreadable. Around her, the kitchen staff stood frozen, unsure whether to applaud her boldness or brace themselves for the fallout. Chef, one of the sous chefs ventured cautiously. That was intense. Lila straightened, smoothing the front of her jacket as if brushing away the tension of the moment. Focus on the next course, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. The night isn't over. Despite her composed demeanor, Lila couldn't deny the satisfaction that simmered just beneath the surface. She had spoken her truth, reclaimed her dignity, and left Ethan Grayson, self-proclaimed master of all he surveyed, reeling. Still, she knew this wasn't the end. Men like Ethan didn't take challenges lightly, and she had just delivered one in front of his entire social circle. Ethan, meanwhile, was struggling to regain control of the evening. He forced a laugh, a hollow sound that barely masked the edge in his voice. Well, he said, raising his glass, it seems we've hired a chef with a flair for drama. Shall we toast to unexpected entertainment? A few guests chuckled uneasily, but the atmosphere remained tense. Ethan's usual charm felt strained, his attempts to deflect the situation falling flat. It was clear that Lila's words had struck a nerve, not just with him, but with everyone present. The rest of the evening unfolded with an air of subdued tension. The following courses were served with the same meticulous care as the first, each dish a testament to Lila's skill and artistry. But the diners' attention had shifted. Instead of marveling at the food, they whispered about the woman who had created it, speculating about her story and the audacity she had shown in confronting Ethan. By the time dessert was served, Ethan could no longer ignore the whispers. They swirled around him like a storm, each murmur another crack in the carefully constructed image of control he had cultivated for years. She's clearly not just a chef, someone murmured. I wonder why she's here, another voice said. Surely she doesn't need the money. Ethan clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. He had built his empire on dominance, on always being the smartest, sharpest, most commanding presence in the room. Yet tonight, a single woman with a steady voice and unwavering resolve had upended everything. As the guests began to leave, Ethan retreated to his private study, the weight of the evening pressing heavily on his shoulders. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal tumbler as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched before him, its lights glittering like a sea of tiny stars. Normally, the view filled him with pride, a reminder of his accomplishments. Tonight, it felt hollow. Lila Carter, The name echoed in his mind, taunting him. He had heard it before, of course. Years ago, her rise in the culinary world had been impossible to ignore. But like so many others, she had eventually faded from the spotlight. At least, that's what he had assumed. Now, the memory of her success gnawed at him, a sharp contrast to the mediocrity he had so casually accused her of. The following morning, Ethan couldn't shake the events of the previous night. As he sipped his coffee in the sunlit kitchen, he found himself scrolling through his phone, searching for articles about Lila Carter. The more he read, the more the weight of his mistakes settled in. Lila's journey was nothing short of extraordinary. She had started as a line cook in a small, family-owned restaurant before earning a scholarship to one of the most prestigious culinary schools in the world. From there, her career had skyrocketed. Her time at Lumiere had solidified her reputation as a visionary, her innovative dishes earning the restaurant its second Michelin star. But what intrigued Ethan most was the sudden end to her tenure at Lumiere. The articles hinted at personal struggles, though none offered concrete details. What could drive a chef at the height of her career to step away from the limelight? Later that day, Ethan made his way to the kitchen. The staff glanced at him nervously as he entered, their movements stuttering under his watchful gaze. Lila was there, her back turned as she inspected a tray of freshly baked pastries. When she sensed his presence, she didn't flinch or turn around immediately. Instead, she finished her task, her composure as steady as ever. "Mr. Grayson," she said finally, her tone polite but distant. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan hesitated, uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "I wanted to thank you for last night," he said, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. "It certainly left an impression." Lila turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I'm glad you found it memorable," she said evenly. "That was the goal." There was no malice in her voice, but Ethan felt the sting of her words all the same. He had expected anger or defiance, perhaps even an apology. What he hadn't expected was this calm, collected strength that made him feel small in comparison. "I also wanted to apologize," he added, surprising even himself, "for what I said. It was out of line." Lila studied him for a moment, her gaze unreadable. "Apologies are easy," she said quietly. "Understanding is harder." "Do you understand, Mr. Grayson?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Ethan didn't know how to respond, not yet, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable, humility. As Lila returned to her work, Ethan left the kitchen, his thoughts swirling. The game had shifted, and he was no longer sure of his footing. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the last he would see of Lila Carter. The hum of the city faded as the soft glow of candlelight illuminated the intimate space of Maison Blanche, a cozy restaurant tucked in an unassuming corner of the city. It was a far cry from Ethan Grayson's grand estate, but it held a quiet charm that suited its purpose. Tonight, Ethan wasn't the powerful host commanding the attention of his peers. He was a man seeking answers, waiting patiently for a woman who had, in the span of one evening, turned his world upside down. Lila Carter entered the room with the same unshakable confidence she had displayed at the party. She wore a simple black dress, understated yet elegant, her hair pulled back to reveal her sharp, striking features. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She never needed to. Her presence alone commanded respect. Ethan rose to greet her, extending a hand that she hesitated to accept. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady as they exchanged a brief, polite nod. "Thank you for meeting me," Ethan began, motioning for her to sit. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm not here for pleasantries, Mr. Grayson," Lila replied, taking her seat across from him. "You said you wanted to talk, so talk." Her directness caught Ethan off guard, but he recovered quickly, smoothing the lapels of his tailored jacket as he settled into his chair. "I wanted to apologize," he said earnestly, "for what I said at the party. It was uncalled for, and it was wrong." Lila raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "An apology?" she echoed. "Is that all this is?" Ethan faltered under her scrutiny, his carefully crafted persona beginning to crack. "No," he admitted, leaning forward slightly. "It's not just an apology. I want to understand." You said something that night about understanding being harder than apologizing. You were right. So, I'm here to listen." For a long moment, Lila regarded him in silence, weighing his words. The restaurant's soft lighting reflected in her dark eyes, which held a depth that made Ethan feel uncomfortably exposed. Finally, she spoke. "You want to understand?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with a challenge. "Fine. Let's start with Lumiere." The name hung in the air, heavy with significance. Ethan nodded, signaling her to continue, though he wasn't sure he was ready for what she would say next. "I didn't just work at Lumiere," Lila began, her tone measured. "I built it. From the ground up. When I joined, it was a struggling restaurant on the brink of closure. The owner was ready to sell, but I saw potential. I convinced him to let me take over the kitchen, and within 3 years, we earned our first Michelin star. The second came 2 years later." Ethan listened intently, the magnitude of her achievements slowly sinking in. He had known of Lumiere's reputation, of course, but hearing her recount its rise was humbling in a way he hadn't anticipated. "So why did you leave?" he asked cautiously. Lila's gaze darkened, her posture stiffening slightly. "Because success has a price," she said simply. "And I paid it." She took a slow sip of water, her eyes distant as she continued. "At first, it was exhilarating. The recognition, the accolades. It felt like validation for all the years of hard work. But the pressure was relentless. Every dish had to be perfect. Every service had to exceed expectations. It wasn't enough to meet the standard. I had to set it." Her voice wavered slightly, and Ethan noticed the faintest tremor in her hands before she steadied herself. "I started losing myself in the process. The long hours, the constant scrutiny, it consumed me. I became someone I didn't recognize. Someone who cared more about stars and reviews than about the joy of cooking." Ethan frowned, leaning forward. "And that's when you left?" "No," Lila said, shaking her head. I stayed. I stayed until the weight of it all nearly broke me. It wasn't just the work. It was the politics, the backstabbing, the endless demand for more. And then one day, I looked in the mirror and realized I didn't know the person staring back at me." Her voice softened, tinged with an ache that Ethan couldn't ignore. "So, I walked away. I left the stars, the fame, all of it. I thought I could find peace in obscurity, but even that came with its own challenges." Ethan was silent, absorbing her story. It was a far cry from the narrative he had constructed in his mind about her, a narrative of privilege and unearned success. The truth was far more complicated, far more human. "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been," he said quietly. Lila's lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. "No, you can't. But I don't need your pity, Mr. Grayson. I didn't come here for sympathy." "Then why did you come?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. "Because I wanted you to understand," she replied. "You walk through life with this arrogance, this sense of superiority, as if the world owes you something. But you don't know what it's like to fight for everything you have, to sacrifice pieces of yourself just to survive." Her words hit Ethan like a blow, each one chipping away at the carefully constructed armor he had worn for years. He opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't need you to fix anything," Lila continued. "I've already done that for myself. But I need you to see that your words, your actions, they have consequences. What you said at that party may have been a fleeting comment to you, but to me, it was a reminder of every battle I've fought to prove my worth." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Ethan felt the weight of her story pressing down on him, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. He wasn't used to feeling powerless, but in Lila's presence, he couldn't escape it. Finally, he spoke. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "I've spent my life taking things for granted. People, opportunities, everything. I didn't realize how much damage I could cause with a few careless words." Lila studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "Acknowledging it is a start," she said. "But words are just words, Mr. Grayson. What matters is what you do next." Ethan nodded, her challenge clear. He didn't know what next looked like, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to who he was before. Not after hearing her story. As they left the restaurant that evening, Lila's parting words lingered in Ethan's mind. "Understanding is the first step," she had said, her voice steady but firm. "Now it's up to you to decide where you go from here." For the first time in his life, Ethan felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, a desire to change. Not for appearances or accolades, but because he knew it was the right thing to do. The next morning, Ethan Grayson sat in his office, staring at the towering windows that framed the city below. Normally, this view filled him with pride, a reminder of all he had built. But today, it felt like an accusation. The sunlit skyline reflected back a man he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. Lila's words echoed in his mind, each one sharpening the edges of his guilt. He had prided himself on his ability to command respect, to control every room he entered. But Lila Carter had exposed him, not just to his peers, but to himself. For years, he had moved through life with a kind of effortless entitlement, believing his success justified his arrogance. Now, for the first time, he questioned the foundation of that success. Ethan's assistant, Amelia, stepped into the room, holding a stack of reports. Her cheerful greeting faltered as she noticed his uncharacteristic silence. "Mr. Grayson? Is everything all right?" He looked up, his expression distant. "Amelia, do you think I'm difficult to work with?" Her eyes widened slightly. It wasn't the kind of question Ethan Grayson asked, or ever needed to. "Well, I wouldn't say difficult," she began cautiously. "You're particular." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Particular? That's a polite way of saying insufferable, isn't it?" Amelia hesitated, unsure how to navigate this sudden vulnerability. "I think people respect you," she said carefully. "But sometimes, respect and fear can look very similar." Her words landed heavily, confirming something Ethan had been avoiding for years. "Thank you, Amelia," he said quietly. "That'll be all for now." As she left, Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He had spent so long building his empire that he had never stopped to question the cost, not just to others, but to himself. Lila's story had been a mirror, forcing him to confront truths he had been too proud to see. He had dismissed her, humiliated her in front of his guests, without even knowing who she was or what she had endured. And for what? A fleeting moment of superiority? Later that day, Ethan found himself pacing in his living room, the silence of his penthouse oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something, to make amends, not just with Lila, but with himself. But where to start? He thought back to their conversation at the restaurant, to the way she had spoken about her sacrifices, her struggles. She hadn't asked for his help, but Ethan couldn't ignore the weight of her words. He needed to understand more about the people his arrogance had hurt. Not just Lila, but everyone whose lives he had touched, often without realizing it. Ethan grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name. Robert Langston, a close friend and business partner. Robert had been at the party that night, one of the few who had laughed at Ethan's biting remark about the food. Ethan suddenly wondered how often Robert had played along, enabling his worst tendencies. He pressed the call button. "Ethan." Robert answered after the second ring, his voice jovial. "What's the occasion?" "Robert," Ethan began, his tone more subdued than usual. "I need your advice." There was a pause on the other end, the hesitation clear. "That's not something I hear every day. What's on your mind?" Ethan took a deep breath. "Do you think I've been careless with the way I treat people?" Robert chuckled nervously. "Ethan, you're a tough guy to impress. That's part of your charm." "Charm," Ethan repeated, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Is that what you'd call it? I'm starting to wonder if it's just another word for being a jerk." Robert's laughter faded, replaced by a more serious tone. "Look, Ethan, you've always been assertive, but maybe you've pushed people harder than you realize. Why are you asking this now?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I met someone who made me see things differently," he admitted. "She challenged me, and I can't get her words out of my head." Robert let out a low whistle. "Sounds like she got under your skin. What did she say?" "She said my words have consequences," Ethan replied, his voice heavy, "that I've been blind to the impact I have on people. And she's right." There was a long silence before Robert spoke again. "If she's right, Ethan, then maybe it's time you did something about it." Ethan's first step was uncomfortable, even humbling. He began reaching out to people he had crossed paths with over the years, former employees, business rivals, even distant acquaintances he had wronged in his relentless climb to the top. Some conversations were met with surprise, others with skepticism, but Ethan persisted. He apologized where he could, listened when words failed, and started to see himself through the eyes of those he had hurt. But his most daunting task remained: earning Lila's respect. She had given him a glimpse of her world, but Ethan knew it wasn't enough. He needed to show her that he had heard her, that her words had not fallen on deaf ears. One evening, Ethan returned to Maison Blanche, unannounced. The restaurant was quieter than before, its warm, intimate atmosphere a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal spaces Ethan was used to. Lila was behind the counter, speaking softly to a member of her staff. When she noticed him, her expression tightened, but she didn't turn him away. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone neutral. "Back so soon?" Ethan approached cautiously, his hands clasped in front of him. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for what you said to me. It forced me to take a long, hard look at myself." Lila studied him for a moment, her gaze as sharp as ever. "And what did you see?" "I saw someone I didn't like," Ethan admitted. "Someone who needed to change." Lila's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. "Words are easy, Mr. Grayson," she said. "Change isn't." "I know," he replied. "That's why I've started trying to make things right. With the people I've wronged, with myself, and with you." She raised an eyebrow. "With me?" Ethan nodded. "I know I can't undo the way I treated you, but I want to prove to you, and to myself, that I'm capable of more. That I'm capable of being better." The room was quiet, the weight of his words hanging between them. Lila searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. What she saw surprised her. A man who, for the first time, seemed genuinely humbled. "Prove it," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for interpretation. "Not with promises. With actions." Ethan nodded, her challenge clear. "I will," he said, "whatever it takes." As he left the restaurant that night, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning. The air outside Maison Blanche was crisp, tinged with the scent of rain that had just begun to mist the streets. Ethan pulled his coat tighter as he walked away from the restaurant, his thoughts heavier than the dark clouds gathering above. Lila's words had landed with the force of a hammer, challenging him to move beyond apologies and into action. For a man used to achieving through sheer will, the uncertainty of what lay ahead unsettled him. A week later, Ethan found himself sitting in the back of his chauffeur-driven car, staring blankly out the window as the city passed by in a blur of lights and motion. His meetings that day had been a series of half-hearted gestures, his mind elsewhere. He had done what he set out to do, acknowledged his flaws, begun making amends, but it felt hollow. He wanted to do more, but he wasn't sure how. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Picking it up, he saw a notification for a charity gala being hosted by one of his associates. Normally, events like this were Ethan's domain, a chance to network, to showcase his influence. But tonight, the idea of mingling with familiar faces filled him with a sense of weariness. Still, something compelled him to go. Maybe it was the hope of distraction, or perhaps a quiet voice urging him to step outside his usual circles. The gala was held at a restored Art Deco theater, its interior a glittering mosaic of gold and deep emerald. Ethan arrived late, slipping in through the side entrance to avoid the spotlight. He hadn't bothered with the usual fanfare. No entourage, no announcement. Tonight, he wanted to observe. He moved through the room with practiced ease, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Familiar faces greeted him with polite nods, though their conversations quickly resumed. It was a strange feeling, to be on the periphery of a world he had once commanded so effortlessly. As he lingered near the edges of the ballroom, his gaze fell on a small stage where a speaker was addressing the crowd. Her voice was calm and measured, yet it carried an authority that held the room in rapt attention. Ethan stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. It was Lila. She stood behind the podium, her posture poised and confident. Gone were the stark whites of her chef's uniform. Tonight, she wore a simple yet elegant dress in deep burgundy, her hair swept back to reveal a pair of understated earrings. But it wasn't her appearance that held Ethan's focus. It was the passion in her words. Food has the power to bring people together, she was saying, her voice steady yet warm. It tells a story, preserves traditions, and creates memories. But too often, access to quality, nutritious meals is seen as a privilege rather than a right. That's why I started this initiative, to ensure that no one has to choose between feeding their family and paying their bills. Ethan's chest tightened as he listened. This was Lila's world, one driven not by ego or profit, but by purpose. Her initiative, aptly named Plated with Purpose, sought to bridge the gap between fine dining and food security. It was a concept so simple, yet so profoundly impactful, that Ethan found himself wondering why he hadn't thought of it before. As the applause swelled and Lila stepped off the stage, Ethan made his way through the crowd, his eyes fixed on her. She spotted him almost immediately, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Mr. Grayson," she said as he approached, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," Ethan admitted. "But I'm glad I came." Lila crossed her arms, her gaze cool but not unfriendly. "And why is that?" "Because I got to see what drives you," he replied. "And it's impressive." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Impressive? That's quite the compliment coming from you." Ethan smiled faintly, unbothered by her sarcasm. "I mean it. What you're doing here. It's more than just impressive. It's important. And it's made me realize how small my own ambitions have been by comparison." For a moment, Lila said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then, with a tilt of her head, she gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. "Walk with me," she said. They moved through the crowd, weaving between tables adorned with centerpieces of fresh herbs and seasonal produce. An intentional choice, Ethan realized, meant to highlight the mission of the evening. When they reached a quieter spot near the edge of the ballroom, Lila turned to face him. "So," she said, folding her arms. "What do you want, Ethan? Why are you really here?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question's directness. "I want to help," he said finally. "Not because I feel guilty, or because I'm trying to fix things overnight, but because I believe in what you're doing. And I think I have the resources to make a difference." Lila's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. "You believe in what I'm doing," she repeated, her tone skeptical. "And you think throwing money at it will solve everything?" "No," Ethan said quickly. "I know it's not that simple, but I also know that change takes resources, time, energy, connections. I can offer all of that if you'll let me." Lila considered his words carefully, her gaze never leaving his. Finally, she let out a quiet sigh. "You're persistent. I'll give you that," she said. "But persistence isn't enough. If you want to help, you'll have to prove that you're committed, not just for a week or a month, but for the long haul." Ethan nodded, her challenge clear. "I understand," he said, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ethan stayed until the event ended, taking the opportunity to learn more about Lila's initiative and the people it served. By the time he left, his mind was buzzing with ideas, a sense of purpose igniting within him that he hadn't felt in years. As he rode home in the quiet of his car, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about redemption. It was about transformation. Lila had challenged him to be more, to do more, and for the first time, he was ready to rise to the occasion. Ethan Grayson had always been a man who moved mountains, albeit for his own benefit. But now, as he sat in his study, the glow of his laptop casting shadows on the walls, he found himself charting a path not for profit but for purpose. The charity gala had planted a seed in his mind, one that had been nurtured by Lila's words and her unwavering commitment to change. For the first time, he felt compelled to act on behalf of something greater than himself. Stacks of documents surrounded him, plans for initiatives he'd barely begun to understand. He was reading about food deserts, nutritional inequity, and the logistics of urban farming, terms that had never crossed his radar before. Each statistic he encountered chipped away at his ignorance, forcing him to confront a reality far removed from his world of tailored suits and million-dollar deals. "Mr. Grayson," Amelia said, stepping into the room cautiously. "You've been at this for hours. Should I clear your schedule for tomorrow?" Ethan looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. "No," he replied, "but I'll need time to meet with someone. Make arrangements for me to see Lila Carter again. This time at her restaurant." Amelia blinked in surprise but nodded. "Understood." The next afternoon, Ethan arrived at Maison Blanche unannounced, much to the bewilderment of Lila's staff. The restaurant was quiet, caught in the lull between lunch and dinner service. Lila emerged from the kitchen in her apron, her expression neutral but tinged with curiosity. "Mr. Grayson," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the honor?" "I have a proposition," Ethan said, his tone serious. "But before I get into that, I want to see the heart of what you do. Show me your kitchen." Lila arched an eyebrow. "My kitchen?" "Yes," Ethan said firmly. "I want to understand how it all works. Not just the glamour on the plate, but the effort behind it." For a moment, Lila seemed to consider turning him away, but something in his demeanor, his persistence, perhaps, made her relent. "Fine," she said, "but don't get in the way." The kitchen of Maison Blanche was a world unto itself. The space was compact but meticulously organized, every surface gleaming and every utensil in its place. Lila moved through it like a conductor guiding an orchestra, her staff responding to her instructions with precision. Ethan stood at the edge of the room, observing in silence. The heat, the noise, the endless motion. It was a far cry from the sterile boardrooms where he had spent most of his career. Here, every second mattered, every movement purposeful. He watched as Lila worked, her hands a blur of motion as she garnished plates with delicate care. "You run this place like a machine," Ethan remarked after some time. "It's impressive." "It's not a machine," Lila replied, not looking up from her work. "It's a team. Everyone here has a role, and we succeed because we respect each other's contributions." Her words struck a chord with Ethan, who had built his empire on the backs of people he rarely acknowledged. The comparison was humbling, and he couldn't ignore the lesson embedded in her response. After the service concluded, Lila joined Ethan in the dining area, the tension between them softened by the shared experience. She poured herself a glass of water and sat across from him, her posture relaxed but alert. "All right," she said, setting her glass down. "You've seen the kitchen. Now tell me about this proposition." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. "I want to fund your initiative, plated with purpose. Not just with money, but with resources, connections, logistics, whatever you need to expand it." Lila's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "And why would you do that?" "Because I believe in what you're doing," Ethan replied. "And because I want to prove that I'm capable of more than just writing checks." She studied him carefully, as though searching for cracks in his sincerity. "You know this isn't a quick fix, right?" she said. "It's not about flashy events or press releases. It's about real, sustained effort." "I know," Ethan said, "and I'm ready for that." Lila leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. "If I agree to this, you'll have to work, really work. That means showing up, getting your hands dirty, and committing for the long haul. No backing out when it gets inconvenient." "Agreed," Ethan said without hesitation. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken challenges. Finally, Lila extended her hand. "All right, Mr. Grayson, let's see if you can keep up." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Ethan threw himself into Plated with Purpose, attending meetings with community leaders, visiting underserved neighborhoods, and learning about the complexities of food distribution. Lila was always a step ahead, her knowledge and experience guiding every decision. Their dynamic was equal parts collaboration and tension, Ethan's business acumen clashing at times with Lila's grassroots approach. But slowly, they found a rhythm. Ethan began to see the world through Lila's eyes, understanding the nuances of her work and the people it served. He realized that his wealth wasn't a solution in itself. It was a tool, one that required careful and thoughtful application. Under Lila's guidance, he learned to wield it responsibly. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and site visits, Ethan and Lila found themselves sitting on the steps of a community center, their shoulders brushing as they rested. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly turned soil from a nearby urban garden. "You're different than I expected," Lila said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "How so?" "You're trying," she said, a hint of warmth in her tone. "Most people in your position wouldn't bother." He smiled faintly, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Most people in my position don't meet someone like you." Lila rolled her eyes, but there was no denying the soft curve of her lips. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Grayson." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of their shared work heavy but satisfying. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was building something real, something that mattered. The first whispers of autumn swept through the city as Ethan Grayson found himself back at Maison Blanche, now a familiar and oddly comforting place. The once unfamiliar sounds of clattering pots and hurried footsteps in the kitchen had become part of his routine. For months, he had worked alongside Lila Carter, not as an equal. He was still learning, but as someone willing to unlearn the arrogance that had defined his life. Ethan glanced around the restaurant's modest dining area. Tonight was different. Tables were set not with Maison Blanche's usual elegance, but with simplicity, a nod to the theme of the evening. This wasn't a night for luxury. It was a celebration of progress, a fundraiser for Plated with purpose that had grown beyond anything Ethan or Lila had anticipated. Guests began to trickle in, many of them familiar faces from the communities they had worked with: local farmers, food bank volunteers, small business owners. Ethan had reached out to them personally, determined to show that this project wasn't about optics but about connection. He even noticed a few of his former business associates in the crowd, drawn more by curiosity than altruism. In the kitchen, Lila adjusted her chef's jacket, the weight of the evening pressing lightly on her shoulders. She had orchestrated countless events like this, yet tonight felt different. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight alone. Ethan had stepped up, surprising her at every turn with his commitment and vulnerability. "Chef, we're ready for the first course," a sous chef called out. Lila nodded, her expression calm but determined. "Let's make it count." As the courses were served, each plate told a story. Local ingredients from the urban farms Ethan had helped establish were transformed into works of art under Lila's guidance. The diners were moved not just by the food but by the meaning behind it, a reminder that even the simplest ingredients could create something extraordinary when treated with care. When the final course was cleared, the room quieted. Lila stepped onto the small stage, a microphone in hand. She stood tall, her presence commanding yet approachable. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "Thank you for joining us tonight." This project began as a simple idea: to bridge the gap between privilege and necessity, to ensure that access to nutritious meals isn't a luxury but a right. What we've accomplished together is proof that change is possible when people care enough to act. Applause filled the room, but Lila wasn't finished. She glanced toward Ethan, who stood at the back of the room, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I'd like to acknowledge someone who's become an unexpected partner in this journey," she continued. "When I first met Ethan Grayson, I'll admit I had my doubts. But over the past few months, he's shown me, and himself, that change is possible, even for those who least expect it." The audience turned to look at Ethan, their applause growing louder. He felt a flush of embarrassment, but also a deep sense of pride. He nodded in acknowledgement, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible. After the event, as the last guests trickled out and the staff began cleaning up, Ethan found Lila standing near the stage, her arms crossed as she surveyed the room. He approached quietly, unsure how to break the silence. "You were incredible up there," he said finally. Lila turned to him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's not about me. It's about the work." "Still," Ethan pressed, "you've done something remarkable here." Lila studied him for a moment before speaking. And you've surprised me, Ethan. I didn't think you'd stick with this, let alone grow into it. But you have. Her words carried a weight that Ethan didn't take lightly. I had a good teacher, he said softly. The room fell quiet again, but it was a comfortable silence. Finally, Lila spoke. So, what's next for you? Ethan hesitated, the question catching him off guard. For so long, his life had been defined by his career, his wealth, his dominance. But now, those things felt secondary. I don't know, he admitted, but I know it's not going back to who I was. This project, it's changed me. You've changed me. Lila's smile softened, her defenses lowering ever so slightly. Well, she said, if you're serious about sticking around, there's plenty more work to do. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan replied. The weeks that followed brought challenges, but also victories. Together, Ethan and Lila expanded Plated with purpose, securing grants, recruiting volunteers, and building infrastructure to serve more communities. Their partnership deepened, built on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding of how far they'd come. One evening, as they walked through the quiet streets after a long day, Ethan glanced at Lila. You know, he said, his tone light but sincere. Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Lila raised an eyebrow, though her smile betrayed her amusement. Don't get too sentimental on me, Grayson, he laughed, shaking his head. I'm serious, Lila. You showed me a world I'd been too blind to see, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Lila didn't respond immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. They continued walking, their steps falling in sync, the city lights flickering above them. In that moment, neither of them needed words. They had found something rare, something worth holding on to. As the seasons changed and the city moved forward, so did they. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, Ethan Grayson understood what it meant to build something that truly mattered.